Welcome to Midnight Grove, where quiet stories unfold like brushstrokes across a canvas and forgotten pieces find their way back to you. Tonight's story is The Man Who Woke Up in a Painting, a tale of unfinished art, memory, and the quiet corners of ourselves we leave behind. Victor, an artist who long ago walked away from his own work, finds a mysterious painting at an estate sale, a golden garden, a figure at a gate, and something left incomplete. Each night, the painting draws him in, until one day he realizes he's no longer just observing. He's part of it. And the only way out is to finish what he started. So settle in, close your eyes, and let the story gently unfold. Chapter 1. The Unfinished Canvas. Victor had never been much for estate sales. There was something uncomfortable, almost intrusive about walking through the remnants of someone else's life. Their furniture arranged just so, their trinkets lined up on dusty shelves, strangers quietly bidding on objects that once meant something to someone now gone. But that afternoon, as the sky hung low and grey, the gallery owner he worked for insisted he tag along. "You might find something interesting," she had said. "They're clearing out an old artist's estate. Half-forgotten paintings, sketches, unfinished pieces. It could be worth a look." Victor wasn't sure what he expected. A few scattered canvases, some faded charcoal drawings, nothing more. What he didn't expect was the painting. Aiku. It was tucked away in a back room, leaning against the wall behind a stack of forgotten frames. Large but not oversized. Muted tones at first glance, soft golds, dusky greens, and the faint shimmer of something caught in perpetual twilight. The painting was of a garden. At its center stood a narrow stone path, winding between overgrown hedges and wildflowers that seemed to sway even though the air was still. The sky above was painted in long, careful brushstrokes of late afternoon light, the kind that made shadows stretch just a little longer than they should. And there in the middle distance stood a figure, faceless, turned away. Victor tilted his head. The figure was slender, dressed simply. One hand rested lightly against a gate at the far edge of the garden, half open. And though their face was hidden, there was something unmistakably intentional about how they were positioned, as if waiting for someone. Aiku. Victor stared at it longer than he intended. There was something unfinished about the piece. Not just technically, though a few corners still seemed to fade into underpainted washes, but emotionally. It felt like the artist had walked away mid-sentence, like there was something waiting to be resolved. He found himself reaching out, running a thumb along the edge of the frame. He didn't even realize he'd decided to buy it until it was already loaded into the back of his car. That night, Victor couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, the faint sounds of the city muffled beneath his apartment window, his mind restless. He kept thinking about the painting, the colors, the soft curve of the path, the figure standing at the gate. Around 3 in the morning, he gave up and padded quietly to the living room. The painting leaned against the wall where he'd left it, its surface catching the dim glow of the streetlights outside. Victor stood in front of it for a long time, and without thinking, he reached forward and touched the canvas. The canvas felt cool beneath his fingertips, rough, textured, just as any oil painting would. But for a split second, Victor could have sworn it gave slightly beneath his touch, almost like fabric stretched too thin. He pulled his hand back, shook his head. It's late. I'm imagining things. Still, when he returned to bed, he couldn't shake the image of that figure at the gate. Motionless, faceless, the golden garden stretching endlessly behind them. Aiku. That night, when Victor finally drifted into sleep, he dreamed vividly. He stood on a stone path, soft grass beneath his shoes. The air smelled faintly of lavender and something older, something like sun-warmed stone after a rain. The sky overhead was a soft, dusky gold, and before him stretched the same garden, every hedge, every flower bed exactly as it appeared on the canvas. But what made his breath catch was that the figure was no longer distant. They stood only a few paces ahead, hands still resting lightly against the gate. But this time, Victor could see they were turning slightly. Not enough to reveal their face, just enough to suggest they might at any moment look back. Aiku. He woke before they did. Aiku. The next morning, Victor rubbed the sleep from his eyes, feeling slightly disoriented. The dream had felt too real. The sense, the warmth of the light, the quiet hum of something just beyond reach. He padded back to the living room, half curious, half anxious. The painting stood where he left it, but as he looked closer, his stomach twisted. The figure in the painting had shifted, only slightly, but unmistakably. Their posture now tilted more toward the foreground, one shoulder angled differently. The gate opened just a fraction wider. Aiku. Victor blinked hard. Maybe it had always looked like that. Maybe he hadn't noticed. But the longer he stared, the less convinced he became. Aiku. That evening, unable to resist, he stayed up late again, sitting quietly across from the painting. The street lights flickered outside. The hum of passing cars softened into background noise. And slowly, without realizing it, his eyes grew heavy. Sleep found him there, seated on the worn armchair, hands folded loosely in his lap. And once again, he dreamed of the garden. This time he walked further. The stone path curved gently beneath his feet. The hedges taller here, flowers brushing against his hands as he passed. The light remained the same, that soft, endless twilight that felt neither morning nor evening. Ahead, the figure stood by the gate, and when Victor reached them, they turned just slightly more. He still couldn't see their face, but he could feel something. Recognition, or perhaps expectation. Aiku. He woke with a start. The faint scent of lavender still clung faintly in his nose, and when he glanced back at the painting, his chest tightened. The figure had shifted again, closer now, the gate nearly open. Victor stared at the canvas for a long time. Every instinct told him he was imagining things, that he was projecting the dream onto the painting. that fatigue and restless nights were clouding his judgment. And yet, his pulse told him otherwise. The shift in the figure's posture was undeniable. The gate, once only cracked, now stood open wide enough that he could make out the suggestion of a path beyond it, a trail leading deeper into shadows. Aiku. He rubbed his eyes, pacing the room. Maybe it was the light. Maybe the original artist had left small details unfinished, and his mind was filling in the blanks. But no amount of reasoning calmed the quiet unease settling over him. Victor was not a man prone to superstition, but this felt like something more than coincidence. Aiku. For the next few days he avoided the painting, left it propped against the wall, draped a sheet over it, focused on work, errands, anything that kept him distracted. But each night, as he lay in bed, the garden returned. Aiku. The dreams grew clearer. He walked the path longer, saw more of the garden's details, a stone bench covered in ivy, a fountain at the center, trickling water softly into the silence, and always the figure waiting by the gate. Each time he reached them, they turned a little more, their hand resting on the edge of the open gate, fingers tapping gently against the wood, as if inviting him to follow. Aiku. One night, as he stood inches from them, Victor finally spoke. "Who are you?" But the figure only tilted their head, their face still obscured, voice silent. He reached out, and just before he could touch them, he woke. Morning light streamed faintly through the blinds. Victor sat up, rubbing his temples. The scent of lavender lingered, faint but persistent. With a sinking feeling, he rose, walking slowly back to the living room. He pulled the sheet away and felt his breath catch. The figure was now fully turned toward the viewer, not quite facing forward, but enough that the suggestion of their gaze felt unmistakable. Their hand no longer rested on the gate. Instead, it hung loosely at their side, as if they had already stepped through. Victor stared, pulse quickening. His eyes flicked toward the lower corner of the canvas, where faintly he now noticed something new. Brush strokes in the shape of footprints. His own? He didn't know. But something deep inside told him he was no longer just observing the painting. Chapter 2. The Garden Beyond the Gate. Victor couldn't explain why he hadn't moved the painting out of his apartment yet. Each day he told himself he would. He'd take it back to the gallery, store it somewhere out of sight, forget about it entirely. But every evening, as the city quieted outside his window and the familiar hush of his apartment settled over him, he found himself drawn back to it. The figure in the painting stood turned toward him now, the gate at their side wide open, the golden light of the garden stretching endlessly behind them. And though the canvas was still, Victor could feel it. The painting was waiting. Aiku. That night, he didn't try to resist sleep. He lay on the couch across from the painting, the faint hum of the city fading beneath the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. It wasn't long before the familiar dream found him. Aiku. He stood once again at the entrance to the garden, The air was warm, filled with the faint scent of lavender and earth. The stone path beneath his feet felt cool and solid, and ahead as always stood the figure, now turned fully toward him. Their features remained indistinct, blurred at the edges, but something about their presence felt almost familiar. They didn't speak, but they raised a hand, palm open. An invitation? Victor hesitated. For nights now he had approached this moment. Watched the figure stand silently by the gate, wondering if he should step forward. Tonight he did. Aiku. The air shifted slightly as he crossed the threshold. The gate, half open for so long, swung gently wider as he passed. The stone path curved ahead, winding deeper into the golden light. Victor glanced back once, half expecting the figure to follow. But they remained at the gate, watching, as if their role was not to lead, but to allow him to walk ahead alone. Aiku. The garden stretched endlessly. Every hedge, flower, stone, carefully painted details now alive beneath his feet. It felt strange, walking inside something he had once studied on canvas. But stranger still, he didn't feel trapped. There was no sense of urgency, no looming presence, only the quiet hum of something unfinished, something waiting to be seen. Victor moved deeper along the path. The garden grew denser here, tall hedges arching overhead, wildflowers brushing against his fingertips. And ahead, a clearing appeared. At its center stood a fountain, its stone edges worn, water spilling gently over, and resting beside it. A canvas, propped against a bench, blank. Victor approached slowly. The air felt heavier now, not oppressive, but thick with something unspoken. He knelt before the canvas, reaching out. The texture beneath his fingers was familiar, rough, unfinished, just like the one in his apartment. Aiku. Behind him, the soft sound of footsteps. He turned. The figure from the gate stood at the edge of the clearing, still faceless, still silent, but their presence felt closer now, almost expectant. Aiku. Victor looked down at the blank canvas once more, and suddenly he understood. Victor swallowed, his fingers still resting lightly against the rough texture of the blank canvas. He glanced up at the figure, still at the edge of the clearing, unmoving, watching. There was no pressure in their gaze, no demand, only quiet expectation. It felt as though they had been waiting for him to realize something obvious but unspoken. He looked back down at the canvas. Its emptiness mirrored something deep inside him. Not a void, but a space left unfinished. Aiku. He stood, turning slowly to take in the clearing. Everything here felt painted with deliberate care. The hedges, the fountain, the soft golden light filtering through unseen branches. But something about the space beyond the path felt hazier. Edges blurred, brush strokes looser. Victor's heart quickened slightly. He knew this sensation, the unmistakable feeling of a work abandoned before it could be completed. Aiku. He turned back toward the figure, his voice soft. This place, it isn't finished. The figure inclined their head slightly, a gesture of agreement. Victor took a step closer. "Is it waiting for me to finish it?" The air seemed to shift around him at the question, though the figure offered no verbal answer. Instead, they slowly raised their hand, gesturing toward the blank canvas once more. Victor hesitated. He was an artist, yes, but he hadn't painted in years, not in any real, meaningful way. He worked at the gallery, curated others' work, sold finished pieces to buyers who cared more for the name than the emotion behind it. His own brushes, his own canvases, had long gathered dust in the corner of his apartment. But now, standing here, in the quiet hum of this half-painted world, he felt something stir, something old, familiar, forgotten. Haiku. He moved toward the canvas again, kneeling before it. His hand hovered above it. No paints, no brushes, no tools. But as his fingertips grazed the surface, color bled beneath them, soft golds, dusky greens, the same hues that filled the garden around him. He drew his hand across the canvas once more, and the landscape began to shift subtly, hedges sharpening, shadows deepening, as if his touch was stitching the scene together. The figure remained still, a silent observer. Victor paused, heart beating steadily. It was like the act of painting wasn't something separate from him. It was him, the missing piece of himself he had long since stopped listening to. Haiku. He glanced up, meeting the figure's gaze, or rather the space where their gaze should have been, and then, for the briefest moment, he saw it. A flicker of a face, half-formed. His own. Haiku. Victor drew in a sharp breath, the realization sinking deep into his chest. This painting wasn't about something external. It wasn't a mystery left behind by another artist, waiting for someone else to complete it. It was his. Always had been. Haiku. The garden, the gate, the endless light, they were the fragments of himself he had walked away from. The act of creation, the unfinished conversation with his own mind. And now, the painting had drawn him back inside, not to trap him, but to remind him he still had more to say. Haiku. Victor stood slowly, turning once more toward the path. The figure remained by the clearing's edge, but their presence no longer felt separate, as if they were no longer waiting, but walking alongside him. The soft sound of the fountain faded as he stepped forward, the golden light ahead shifting. Beyond the clearing, the path opened wider, and Victor knew there was more left to paint. Chapter 3. Finishing the Unfinished. Victor walked slowly, the stone path unfurling before him like a ribbon through the endless golden garden. The soft hum of the world around him pulsed gently, the brushstrokes of hedges and flowers sharpening beneath his steps, details filling in as he moved forward. Each step felt lighter than the last, as though the weight that had pressed on him for years was slowly lifting. He glanced behind once. The clearing, the fountain, the blank canvas, all still there waiting quietly. But the figure who had stood beside the gate and watched him all these nights was no longer in sight. And somehow, he wasn't surprised. The air smelled faintly of lavender and something else now. Something warmer. Like the scent of oil paints left out too long in the afternoon sun, the familiar tang of linseed and pigment, the comforting mess of a studio where the act of creating was still in progress. Victor's heart stirred faintly at the sensation. Aiku. He followed the path as it curved, the light shifting gently overhead. The shadows here grew longer, casting soft patterns across the ground like brushstrokes on an unfinished canvas. For a moment, he wondered if he was walking deeper into the painting, or deeper into himself. Aiku. The garden ahead opened into another clearing, but unlike the one before, this space was different, wider, quieter. At its center stood an easel, not empty, but holding a canvas, half painted. Victor approached slowly, his breath catching, because this painting, he recognized. It was his, one he had started years ago and never finished. A landscape, muted colors, a figure standing at the edge, looking out over an expanse of water. He remembered the frustration, the way he had abandoned it after weeks of work, convinced it wasn't worth completing. But here it stood, its surface waiting patiently. Aiku. He reached out, fingertips grazing the canvas. The texture felt real beneath his hand, and something inside him shifted. Aiku. Victor glanced around. The garden felt still now, but not empty, as though every brushstroke of this place was waiting, not for him to leave, but to pick up where he left off. Aiku. He closed his eyes briefly, taking in the quiet hum of the world around him. All his life, he had painted in fits and starts, always searching, always doubting, turning away before a piece felt whole. But here, there was no pressure, no expectation, just the gentle, persistent invitation. Finish. Aiku. He opened his eyes and began. He moved his hand across the canvas. No brushes, no paints, just the intent behind each gesture. And the colors responded, filling in, blues deepening into the water's edge, the sky softening into shades of gold and gray, the figure on the shore gaining definition. He could feel it. How each stroke wasn't about perfection, but completion, about letting the story reach its end, even if it wasn't the ending he once imagined. Aiku. Time drifted, or maybe it didn't exist here at all. Victor lost himself in the rhythm, the quiet focus that had eluded him for so long. Aiku. And as the painting before him neared completion, he felt something else shift. The edges of the garden grew brighter, the light overhead softening, no longer stretched in perpetual twilight. He stood back, surveying the canvas one last time. It felt done. It felt his. The soft sound of footsteps behind him made him turn. The figure from before stood a few paces away. But this time, their features were no longer obscured. Victor stared. It was his own face, softer perhaps, more certain. Not a double, but an echo, a part of himself he had turned away from. Now whole. Aiku. The figure gave a slight nod, eyes calm. No words were spoken, none needed. Aiku. Victor glanced back at the painting one last time. The colors settled, the scene at peace. And when he turned again, the garden began to dissolve softly around him, brushstrokes fading into light. Aiku. He woke. Morning light filtered through the blinds of his apartment. For a moment, Victor sat very still. The hum of the city outside felt quieter somehow, the restless ache in his chest noticeably absent. He stood, padding to the living room. The painting leaned against the wall. He approached cautiously, and when he looked, the figure in the garden was gone. The gate wide open, the path stretching empty, bathed in soft golden light. Victor smiled faintly, not because the mystery was solved, but because he understood now. The painting had never belonged to someone else. It had been waiting for him to finish, to remember, and now he could. Thank you for joining us tonight at Midnight Grove for The Man Who Woke Up in a Painting. Victor thought the unfinished canvas was someone else's mystery to solve. But some stories are not left behind by others. They're the ones we've walked away from ourselves, waiting patiently for us to return. As you drift into sleep, may you remember, you don't have to complete every piece perfectly. You only have to allow yourself the space to finish. Sleep well, and we'll see you next time for another story.